you. Yeah, I think this will work better. It sounds better. Yeah, so I guess I get to redo OCM Siaya. My name is Jacob Beaton. My tribal name is Joppa Gatwinskik, from up north. And I'm just going to click you through some slides. So I just want to start with this picture. There's tons of photos I could have chosen. This one tells a lot of the story of Indigenous agriculture. And there's lots of them. If you go on our Instagram, which is at Northern Dad, by the way, if you want to go check out the photos. On the furthest right, we have the first red seal chef, Indigenous red seal chef in Canada, Chief Andrew George. And I was explaining to somebody, my mother was the first Indigenous therapist in British Columbia. Now, why is that? Why are we looking at somebody who's not that old as the first? Well, you might not realize, and some of what I want to talk about today is some of the truth that's required for reconciliation and reconciliation, that Indigenous people were not allowed to go to university in this country until quite recently. The only thing you could study in university if you were status Indian was theology, up until very recently. So my mother graduated in the early 90s, first Indigenous person in that field. This is the first Indigenous red seal chef. All of our certified professionals that are Indigenous in Canada, the first in every field, are people who are young today. And that is part of our legacy as a country and where we need to start from when we look at turning things around and making things better for all of us. Now, beside him is Chef Tanya Gawa. She's the newest Indigenous red seal chef. Boy, that's a tongue twister, in BC. And she got her red seal at Tea Creek at our farm. And then we have beside them other young Indigenous people who are training in agriculture and professional cooking on our farm. And they're young folks. We have a lot of very, very young people who are desperate to get into professions, trades, and food production. So that's one of the reasons why I started with that photo. It tells a lot. It tells a lot about our story at Tea Creek and what we're doing and the direction we're trying to move in. So my presentation, it's broken up into a few sections. But first of all, I should let you know where we are in BC. So this is the Indigenous map of BC. I thought I'd switch it up a little bit. We're firmly in Gitxsan territory up in the northwest there. We're a really special growing region. We were called the Okanagan of the North. And that's because we have three significant overlapping environmental zones. We've got the subarctic, the coast, and the interior boreal all overlapping in our valley. So we have all the vegetation from all those areas growing in one place on our farm. It's really cool. And we follow the central southern interior growing schedule there. We're only about 1 week off from the Okanagan when it comes to our planting and harvesting schedule. So even though we're far up north, we can grow a ton of food. It's not a problem. So I'm going to do my presentation here in 4 parts. A good friend of mine said, do 3. And I'm going to be a rebel and I'm going to try for 4 in 20 minutes. So five minutes a section. The first part is credibility. You know, I was thinking, okay, I'm talking to a whole bunch of folks who I don't know who you are. I was recently in a Zoom meeting with some international person and they spent the first 5 minutes just establishing their credibility. And I was like, oh, this is what I should do. I don't want to just be like the native guy up on stage that people are tuning out. I'm like, I want you guys to listen. So I've got a little bit of credibility to establish here. So first of all, on both sides of my family, I come from food producers. I didn't intend to be a farmer. Never in my wildest dreams did I ever think I'd become a farmer. But when I look at my family, tree, it kind of seems obvious now. This is what our farm looks like last season. This was a group that actually came from the downtown east side, and they harvested over 2,000 pounds of vegetables and provided free meals on the downtown east side to anybody with our farm produce for 1 full month. That was really, really cool. We won the land award, BC Land Award for Foodlands last year. That's my wife and I. We were selected by the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization as Canada's food hero this past fall. And I somehow ended up being the opening speaker at an Indigenous strategy event at COP 15 in Montreal. That was hilarious. I showed up in my Carhartts, as you can see there, just going to be a shadow in the back wall. And I walked in and they're like, "You're Jacob from Tea Creek." I'm like, "Yeah." They're like, "You're our opening speaker." I'm like, "No." And then they're like, "Yeah, you got half an hour to prepare your speaking notes." So I was the opening speaker at this COP 15 event, which was amazing, by the way. I learned actually a ton just from being there. So going back to the family tree for a second, on one side, I come from fishermen. This is my ya'a and my ti'i, my grandparents from Kekatla. And the other fishing boat represents my great-grandfather, who could speak 7 languages fluently. He owned his own boat back in the 1800s, and he was an incredible businessman. And a lot of the success that exists in my family on the Indigenous side in business is from him, the teachings that somehow managed to get imparted to the next generations. My ya'a, he was also a fisherman, commercial fisherman, and they all own their own boats. Now this is my grandfather. Just kidding. That's Clint Eastwood. But you can imagine on the other side of my family, I have a grandfather. Wasn't my blood grandfather. My grandmother remarried a cattle rancher in the Okanagan, Oliver. If anybody hears from Oliver, that's where he was. And so I got to go spend my summers starting at like age 4 on a ranch, and I got to be a rancher. You know, cowboy hat and cowboy boots and all. And I was terrified of my grandfather. And again, I'm establishing credibility here, just so those of you who grew up on ranches, you're like, "Yeah, Jacob's one of us." Because my grandfather would take me around the farm and he's constantly threatening to nail me to things. He's like, "I ought to nail you to that fence post. I ought to nail you to that tree. I ought to nail you to the tractor bucket and lift you up and not let you down again." Man, I was so scared of him. And then, you know, but it was also incredibly fun. And then I realized a really big secret, and that is that you cattle ranchers, you're hard on the outside and you're soft teddy bears on the inside. Because I went there with my first girlfriend, and I'm not going to say when that was, but my first girlfriend. Let's go to Grandpa's ranch, and he tucks $20 in my pocket and is like, "Yeah, take her to the movies and go out for dinner, treat her real nice. And there's a hay barn in the back for when you guys get back." And then he got all weepy-eyed and started remembering his first girlfriend and the love letters he used to write to her. And I was like, "Damn, Grandpa, you are like one soft dude underneath the hard as nails exterior." So that's my my ranching experience. So somehow I ended up becoming a farmer. I was doing business consulting before that. And it's a bit of a long story I'm going to skip over right now. But this is what I do. I'm passionate about food sovereignty, Indigenous food sovereignty. I'm passionate about healthy, resilient, local economies that are based around abundant local food. And I hope that's something we can all agree on. This is not something that should be a political discussion. It should not be something that's Indigenous versus non-Indigenous. Everybody in this room should be like, "Yeah, that's something we can look forward to." So please bear with me through all 4 parts, because I promise it's going to end on a positive note. But first, we got to talk about the current situation. So some numbers, boring, cold, hard facts. Nearly minus 10%, that's the decline in farmers between 2016 and 2021 in British Columbia. It's a lot. Like, we're down to like 15,000 and something farmers total for the whole province. Please keep that number in mind, that number there, the 15,000, that'll come in later. And then the 57.8, that's the average age of farmers. It's just going up every time. So please keep that number in mind. It'll come in later. Lastly, only 1% of farmers in Canada are Indigenous. Keep that in mind. That'll come in later. Also, climate events. That's the polite way to call climate disasters these days. Climate events. We've seen them all over British Columbia. This is of course probably the most famous one, but man, we've been impacted up in our area. You know, we've been cut off from the world through flooding in the last few years. You know, about how things are going there. You know, it's all over the place and it's very real. It's impacting people in very, very real ways. 80%, 20%, 32%, and less than 1%. What do these mean? 80% of the world's biodiversity in indigenous controlled lands, which represents 20% of the world's land mass, is under indigenous control. Indigenous peoples, and this is what I learned at Montreal and COPE, which I found really illuminating, and this is an accepted fact, is that indigenous peoples globally are contributing to 32% of the world's climate goals in fighting climate change. And they have access to less than a fraction of 1% of the world's financial resources. So there's all these discussions about fighting climate change and the responsibilities of different countries. And one of the things that is coming into that discussion is the fact that indigenous people are contributing 32% of the world's goals on less than a fraction of 1% of the world's financial resources and tools. Huge, like there's something wrong there. So that's the end of the second section of what I'm talking about and some of the facts I'm wanting to get across. I'm trying to keep it light, you know, we won't go any further than that. That's good enough for a 20-minute keynote. So number 3, and this is where why I was late today, and I was feeling really guilty because I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm perpetuating the myth of running on Indian time, you know, showing up late and stressing out all the staff. That's why I had to thank them, because they were like pretty worried about whether I was going to make it or not, I think. I redid my presentation deck, and I thought I'd add this in there. So this is the third section of my presentation, and that is on some myth busting. Because if we are going to work together, it's going to be really hard to work together if non-Indigenous people are coming to the conversation with beliefs that are factually false. It's a bad foundation to build on, right? You think you're on bedrock, it's actually sand. We wouldn't do that, right? We wouldn't build the barn if we didn't know what was on the ground. And so that's what we need to do in our conversations moving forward. So first one is that Indigenous peoples were food sovereign. And I put the plus. So, because like food sovereignty today, when we talk about it, it's like just having enough food to feed your people. But Indigenous peoples had a surplus of produce, a surplus of food prior to contact and post-contact. We need to keep that part of the conversation in there. So if you look at the food production of what's now British Columbia, and we were to graph it out, and I was going to do this, just I ran out of time. It looks kind of like this in terms of the indigenous food production. It goes like this, it goes up, and then it goes like that. And we'll talk about why. But if you go back and you look at historical record, which I've done, settlers who came to this part of the world came to a place of abundance in terms of food production, and that is well documented. And it was all indigenous agriculture. They were farming. They were farming. Next one, many of the world's most valuable crops were cultivated by Indigenous peoples over thousands of years of intentional agriculture, and not accidental agriculture, not like going into the forest and tweaking some berry bushes. No, farming with hoes, you know, out there working on terraces. I don't know if you saw it in the news last year, but there was another shocking discovery in the plains here in Canada of stone hoes that are thousands of years older than previously thought, proving again that Indigenous people were hand farming much earlier than believed. You know, at the same time period that ancient Egypt was around, Indigenous people were hand farming in the prairies of Canada. So you might have seen this or not. If you haven't, this is a new thing to me that's called the Columbian Exchange. And so you can see all the valuable indigenous crops that got brought to the old world, including potatoes and what else here? Avocados, squashes, sweet potatoes, pumpkins, corn, you know, beans. I don't know if you know, but most of the world's edible beans are from indigenous farmers. The Taino people that Christopher Columbus bumped into were bean farmers. That's what they were. They exported beans. So indigenous peoples were and are agrarian. And this is something I've heard everywhere I've worked in BC when I'm working with First Nations, is we were farmers. We are farmers. That's part of our culture. That's part of our heritage. Now, here's another fun fact. Indigenous peoples used to dominate Canadian agriculture. This is a fact. There are research papers on this. So even long after contact, we're in the like mid 1800s now, and you look at who was producing Canada's food, it was a majority, large majority Indigenous farmers. But here's the crazy thing, and I just learned this, is that they were winning the awards for most innovative farm products, new cultivars, best quality of produce at the fall fairs in the prairies were being won by Indigenous farmers. So we need to talk about what happened. We need to talk about it, folks, because this is the reality. This is the fact. It was the same here in BC. So Indian Act 1876 was partly a result of lobbying from non-Indigenous farmers who said, this isn't fair. We can't compete with Indigenous farmers. You promised us free, easy land, and it's hard because the Native people are winning. You got to make this easier. So Indian Act comes into play in 1876. That makes all Indigenous people wards of the federal government without any human rights anymore. But then here's the real kicker. We have severance policy, the 1880s, peasant policy, and the passive permit system. So severance policy meant severing from the land. You were no longer to farm, allowed to have more than 20 acres if you're Indigenous. So all the multi-thousand acre Indigenous farms were broken up. The land that was on reserve was also broken down into 20 acre parcels. And this impacts us today. This policy is alive and well today because one of my best friends who's an Indigenous farmer, farming with all his own money, working his butt off, he's on a reserve and he's hit his 20 acre limit. He wants to expand and he can't because that's how the reserves were parceled. He's not allowed to have another 20 acres. Can you imagine? Can you imagine someone coming to you saying, hey, you've hit your 20 acre limit today in 2023. You can't, no, sorry, you can't have any more. So that's the severance policy. So any Indigenous person who had more than 20 acres, it was split up, it was off reserve, it was auctioned off. You weren't allowed to own fee simple land off reserve if you're Indigenous. And then there's the peasant policy, and the peasant policy is a really fun one. All of you will love this one. If you're Indigenous, you were not allowed to use tractors or machinery or any sort of technology. You're only allowed to use hand tools. So if you had them, they were taken from you. Again, the legacy of this is very, very much alive today. Where I live, there are 6 different vibrant First Nations with thousands of people that live there, and we don't have a single tractor. I was the first Indigenous person in 2 valleys in nearly 8,000 people to buy a tractor. Can you imagine? This is our history. This is the reality that Indigenous people still live in today, is you can't get a frickin' tractor because it wasn't allowed. It was illegal. Pass and permit system. Okay, you're gonna just keep falling in love with our Canadian history here, because pass and permit, it gets better. So you're not allowed to have a tractor. You're only allowed to have a rake and a pitchfork to do your farming. You can't have more than 20 acres. Now, you're not allowed to buy inputs. You are not allowed to buy seeds or fertilizer without what was called a pass and permit. And so Indian agents were told, if the person is leaving the reserve, they have to have a pass or permit to buy anything. If it is seeds, fertilizer, anything for food production, they are not allowed. You do not issue them the pass to leave the reserve, and you do not give them the permit to go and buy it. Okay, next number, 25 times. 25 times is a new one to me. We're working, one of our biggest problems is funding, accessing any kind of funding. And we're talking to a funder who's going through a big reconciliation change, and they audited their programs. They're a major funder. And they said that Indigenous peoples are required to do 25 times as much paperwork and reporting for the same dollar as non-Indigenous. 25 times, not 1.25 times. 25 times. It's a huge problem, and we run into it all the time. Our farm accessed a COVID relief grant. They tore up the contract once they found I was Indigenous and replaced it, and it was no longer a grant. We had to send in all our receipts. We spent $60,000 of our own life savings, sent in the claim. It was 5 cents off. I'm not making this up. 5 cents off, and it got rejected. If you are non-Indigenous to access that COVID relief grant, it got deposited in your account. That's the difference that we face today in 2023. This number I just learned last week, and I want to share it with you. I've been chasing a certain farm lender that's a Crown Corporation for money for, I'm off reserve, and it says all off reserve, so that's not the issue. We have fee simple land. The only difference between me and a lot of you is that I have a status card, and maybe my skin color is like racially ambiguous. I'm like, hey, I'd like to get a loan for my farm. And they were like, oh yeah, sounds great. And I'm like, oh, and by the way, you should know I'm First Nations. Oh, wait, we don't do that. We don't do First Nations farm lending. So then I reached out and we talked last week, and they're like, hey, we've got a new plan. We're doing First Nations farm lending now. And I was like, really cool, awesome. Like, what's your policy? So we went through that. I'll skip that part of the story. Number one, that's how many loans have been given to a First Nations owned farm in BC. Not 1 dozen, not 100, not 1,000, 1 in the whole province. Can you imagine? As a non-Indigenous rancher farmer, that's the number for the whole province. So, are we hunter-gatherers? No, that's a modern myth. That's created out of what I just shared with you, because what do you have left when you can't have a tractor? You can't buy your seeds. You're only allowed to farm with a pitchfork. You go and you friggin' hunt and gather. So we'll shake that one off. That's always hard to talk about. It's a little bit brutal. So let's get into the good news. And this is why I asked you to stick with me, because that part's the hard part. Now we're into the really good part. Okay, and this is where I end. So at Tea Creek, we've come up and invented a model of training, learning, recovering ourselves, rebuilding our economy around abundant local food. And we are land-based. So all of our work we do is hands-on learning and on the land. How many of you grew up on a farm and are like, I learned more on that farm doing stuff than I learned in the classroom? And that's how we train at Tea Creek. We are Indigenous-led. That means the majority of daily decisions, hourly decisions, are made by Indigenous people on our farm. A vast majority of our staff are Indigenous. All of our trainees, all of our participants are Indigenous. We are culturally safe. We do not expect you as an Indigenous person to be anything other than who you are when you come to our farm to learn. And we avoid siloing. We do lots. We're not just training people. We're people, 87% of people who came to our farm last year said they received significant physical and mental health benefits from participating. We produce food. We produce and we distribute a lot of food, 20,000 pounds. We're doing 10,000 pounds an acre right now of produce production that goes right into our local communities. So we have a lot of wins, 1,200 unique site visits from Indigenous people who came to learn at our farm. Keep that in mind. You'll see we have a big gap. So we do get funded. We get funded, and that's a little blue thing down there. So funding formulas are based on, in what we do, are based on how many people enroll, sign up, and show up. And that's the little blue thing. The green thing is how many people have signed up for long-term training. How many people want to become farmers? How many people want to dedicate themselves to learning and becoming self-employed and employed in a significant way? That's the green one. And then the other one is all the extra people that come for one-day workshops that show up, and they're there to learn as well. 1,200. We do trades training. Big part of what we do. So we're partnered with an industry training authority. Why? because in 2021, we exposed more Indigenous people to trades on our farm than all of the colleges and universities in BC put together. So imagine what Indigenous-led can do, land-based can do. It's amazing, it's transformative. And now I'm out of time, so I'm just gonna skip forward. You know, we donate our produce. That's a big thing. That's part of our Indigenous way of doing it. We gift it because we have it. And then other people in our community, they gift when they have. So our freezers are full. You know, they're full of food that the community brings to us that they have in surplus. So we donate our surplus, they donate their surplus. It's called the gift economy, and it works really well for us. So yeah, they're just some of the photos of some of the food distribution. We donated out more than, this is the hereditary chief of our territory with his granddaughter. We donated out in one day 5,000 pounds of food last fall, and that directly fed 300 households in one day. It was amazing. We've been getting testimonials from people. This is one of them. I'm gonna just sort of skip by it, but I bolded some things there that might stand out. So now let's talk about the strategy. I'm sorry, folks, I grabbed the old draft version by accident, so it's a little out of date, but you'll see that there's Indigenous agriculture on there, and a term that I've been pushing, which is reconciliation. We've got to get away from just land acknowledgements and start changing policies that change that number one. The number one farm loan, that's a policy issue. It's an easy fix. You change policy, you open the door to a flood of 1,200 potential Indigenous farmers in one region of BC. So this is a map, and this is my second last slide, I believe. This is a map, and we worked with the Ministry of Agriculture on this last year, starting to map out where are Indigenous food sovereignty and food production initiatives in BC. And you can see it's pretty diverse. And so what I want to point out is ours is just one of these dots in the upper Northwest. And let's go back to the numbers. Let's go back to how many farmers we lost. Let's look at the average age. Our average age of dedicated trainees is 30. Our average age, when you include the extra 1,200 people, which includes teenagers and youth who aren't eligible for dedicated training, is 22. We introduced 1,400 young people to farming in 1 year alone in one tiny part of BC. Imagine if this kind of model existed all over the place. We will turn it around. We will turn around the decline. We will turn around the problems we're facing. We're going to increase. So what my pitch is here, folks, is that when we all get behind Indigenous agriculture, we are not just doing it because, hey, it's righting some kind of historical wrong. You're doing it because we all need it. We need food security. We all need it. We need more farmers. We all need more farmers. We need more ranchers. We all need it. We all win when we have more food security and when we have those healthy, resilient economies based on abundant local food. Everybody wins. The planet wins. Every single person in that community wins, no matter your heritage, religion, politics, skin color, your children, the future generations, everybody wins. So that's my little summary. Thank you so much for listening. I'll be around for the next couple of days. If you have questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them. My name's Jacob Beaton. Check out the website, tcreek.ca. Check out our Instagram stream if you want to see what 1,200 plus people, different Indigenous people look like coming to someplace up in the Northwest. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jacob. Now, before we present our next speaker, I just want to call upon our panel for the Transitioning Regenerative Agricultural discussion. If you could head over to the sound booth to get mic'd, that's Corinne, Stan, Dag, Tristan, and Doug. If you could just prepare for your discussion and head over to the sound booth, which is next to the camera, and get mic'd